Hey everybody, it's Friday. It's 5 o'clock. Usually in normal times on Fridays at 5 o'clock, I'm driving home from school, thinking about all the things I'm going to do during the weekend. But we are not in normal times now, are we? So I'm not driving home. I am at home and I'm about to teach you some history. But I do still have some very exciting plans for this weekend. I was thinking about maybe kind of just chilling at home and relaxing. I don't know, take a little break for a little while. All right, my name is Mason Logereau, coming to you from the Austin, Texas area at Pflugerville High. Now, hopefully you figured out by now that Mr. Smith and I are the two teachers that are leading these world history reviews. You can tell the difference between the two of us because Mr. Smith is the cool, hip teacher who talks about modern music. I'm the giant history nerd that tells really bad dad jokes. So it's easy to kind of tell us apart. All right, what are we talking about today? Today, we are talking about what I consider to be the second most important topic in world history, and that is the Enlightenment. Because we all know what the most important topic is, right? Of course, it's the Mongols. Actually, if you think about it, my students, I think, get tired of me talking about three things during the year. There are three things that I will not shut up about that they get really tired of. One is Buddhism spreading to East Asia over the Silk Road. Two is the Mongols. Three is the Enlightenment. I talk about those a ton in class, and I'm going to do that today as well, but I'll try and shorten it down as much as I can. But actually, when you talk about the Enlightenments and how it led to all the Atlantic revolutions, the American, French, Haitian, South American revolutions, and we also need to talk about nationalism as well as a force that comes out of these revolutions. So you need to kind of know already about the Atlantic revolutions. Sadly, we don't have time to get into details about those today, but I will bring them up. And then we're also going to talk about how to compare and contrast two sources and how to think about kind of common themes that we see running through documents. So that, you know, if you had an assignment where you had like, let's say 5 primary sources and you had to put them together to, I don't know, make an argument of some kind, you could figure out common themes through them to put them together. But we'll talk about that some today. All right, before we get started, yesterday Smith asked y'all to come up with some outside evidence for this DBQ that we've been working on all week. So if you have not watched the Monday through Thursday videos so far, you need to go back later, not right now, don't pause yet. Go back and watch those because really we have put together a DBQ step by step through the week. And this is kind of our last part of it. So if you remember, the documents are in the Google Drive that is down below me. Click the see more if you need. It's labeled 4.1, 4.2 homework. But we worked on intros with contextualization and thesis statement on Monday. Tuesday, we took the documents and made claims. Wednesday, we worked on sourcing. And then Smith talked to you all about outside evidence yesterday, because on this year's DBQ, you need to have 2 pieces of outside evidence. Now, Smith talked about this a lot yesterday, but just remember, the evidence has to be relevant to the argument you're making. Ideally, the evidence is going to support the claim that you're making. It's going to be another way to prove it that goes beyond the documents. But it can't just be a random fact you throw in there. Like here, we're talking about Portugal and the Indian Ocean. If you write, did you know that Portugal also borders Spain? Well, okay, yes, the country of Portugal does border the country of Spain, but that has nothing to do with Indian Ocean trade. It is not relevant at all, really, to this topic. Make sure it's relevant to your topic, and ideally that it's supporting the claim you're making. So this is one paragraph that we looked at, and he did mention the fact that we used document 1 to support this claim that the Portuguese never extended their control beyond a few ports. But document 1 by itself doesn't really fully support the claim, doesn't really fully prove it. So you can see what he wrote in red. This is his outside evidence. And you can see there at the bottom, despite their attempts, the Portuguese attempts to control the Indian Ocean trade network, they never gained more than 50% of control of the spice trade, because the people that were merchants already there in the Indian Ocean network were just not interested in Portuguese goods. Portuguese goods were not really that nice, especially compared to stuff coming from South Asia and East Asia. So the Portuguese used their fast ships, their powerful ships, to control those ports, but they still never controlled a large percentage of it. Now, notice here, Smith also puts never gained more than 50%. He does not put an exact number on it, like the exact percentage of the spice trade the Portuguese controlled. First off, I don't think you can put an exact number on something like that. That kind of number is going to fluctuate through time. Secondly, no one's expecting you to walk into the AP test knowing exactly how much of the spice trade the Portuguese controlled in a given year. That would just be way too much detailed information to expect you to know. So really my idea when it comes to outside evidence, be as specific as you possibly can. If you've got never gained more than 50%, that works, okay? The same thing goes for years. If you're talking about an event, but you can't remember the exact year that it happened, that's okay. Just get in the ballpark and you'll be fine. You know, like you go, oh, wait, crap, I can't remember. What year did the French Revolution start? Don't worry about it. Just put the late 1700s. That covers a large time period and you're good, okay? So be as specific as you can, obviously, but don't feel like you're expected to pull in exact numbers because no student's going to be able to do that about every topic in world history on the AP test. All right. The other one, remember in this last paragraph, he used documents 2 and 3 to talk about other competition that the Portuguese had in the Indian Ocean trade networks. And we're talking about other kingdoms in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then at the end in red, this is the extra or outside information that Smith added, bringing in the Safavid Empire as another example of an Asian state that the Portuguese were in competition with. And that's perfect because the Safavids are never mentioned in any of the documents, but they're an excellent example of another state. There are plenty of states that are mentioned in documents 2 and 3, and here Smith is giving you another one. That is a perfect piece of outside information. So notice at this point now, we have written an entire DBQ this week. We've gone through all the points. The only one we have not talked about is that complexity point, that 10th point. But like I said, that's a really, really hard point to get. You really need to focus on the other 9, especially this year with only 45 minutes to write and 5 documents. Getting 9 out of 10 is going to be hard enough. You focus on that. If you feel like you have a way to get that complexity point, especially on this DBQ or any DBQ you might practice on for the next couple of weeks, talk to your teacher individually about that. I think that'd be a really good conversation to have with them about, hey, what do you think about using these, this kind of argument to make a complex argument? But really, I think for the large majority of you, you focus on those other 9 points and you're going to be golden if you can do that. All right, let's talk some Enlightenment now. Woohoo! I do love me some Enlightenment, guys. I gotta tell y'all. All right, before we start, what exactly is the Enlightenment? Okay, yes, it is a philosophical movement from the 1600s. But let's think about this. Put yourself in the shoes of like the average person in the world in 1600. Does the average person have any idea that the Enlightenment is going on? No, not at all. No one woke up one morning and went, ooh, I think today's the first day of the Enlightenment. That is not how it happened, okay? In fact, I don't even think the philosophers like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and Voltaire, they probably didn't even realize they were going through the Enlightenment, right? They're writing books of their own ideas, but oftentimes, especially when it comes to something like philosophy or art, these big changes or these big movements that happen in them, people don't realize it for much, much longer because we're not going to see the effects of the Enlightenment immediately in the 1600s. We're not going to see it until the 17 and 1800s. So just kind of keep in mind that we talk about the Enlightenment and we put maybe a time period in it, but that doesn't mean that anybody else knows what's going on. I mean, think about it this way. The average person's not reading philosophy books. Okay, pop quiz for you. Can any of you name a philosopher that is currently alive in the year 2020? Anybody? Yeah, see, I would have a hard time doing that as well. Oftentimes, the ideas of philosophers don't really seep down into public consciousness until much, much later on. And that's especially true in the 1600s, Because again, remember, okay, yes, there are books. The printing press has been around for a while, but they're still really difficult to make and they're extremely expensive. So most people don't own that many books. Plus, it's not like there's a Barnes & Noble at every mall in Europe in the 1600s, because also there are no such things as malls, but you get my point. Also, literacy rates are still fairly low as well. So really, nobody in the 1600s has any idea this is going on, but we're going to see the impact of it later on. All right, so what exactly are the beliefs of the Enlightenment? First off, it's a focus on reason. It's the idea that humans are really smart, we all have really big brains, we can observe the world around us, we can come to conclusions and new truths about the world around us. And it does kind of begin to downplay traditional religion. And by traditional religion, since we're talking about Europe, we're obviously talking Christianity here, whether it be teachings of the Catholic Church or the new Protestant denominations. Now, let me be very, 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 very clear. No one in the Enlightenment is talking about atheism or anything like that, okay? Most of these guys, well, almost all of them are still Christians. It's just that they're not really focused on traditional ideas of the church, like philosophy had been for so long, but really on human reason to understand truths of the universe. The idea that you don't need a holy book or you don't need a church leader to tell you how the world is operating. It's not a coincidence that the Enlightenment comes after the Protestant Reformation, which again was a pretty big idea, questioning the church, right? And after the scientific revolution, Newton, Galileo, all those guys trying to figure out the universe, the fact that the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. So traditional church teachings had already been questioned, but the Enlightenment's continuing that. And it also begins to question the ideas of government, the ideas of monarchies. Should there be such a thing as an absolute monarch? And what is interesting is when you look at these first Enlightenment philosophers, none of them are really arguing for democracy necessarily, but just that monarchs need to be more in tune with their citizens. Okay, but like I've already said, it doesn't have an immediate impact in the 1600s. But later on, we're going to see a big impact in politics and government, i.e., we're about to see a bunch of revolutions. Has a big impact on economics. We're not going to talk about that today, so don't worry. If you saw economics and got all scared, it's okay. We're not even going to really touch on it today. But also has a big changes in gender roles as well, and feminism and gender equality, which again is kind of interesting because some of these original Enlightenment philosophers were not real big on the idea of gender equality or education for women. In fact, some of them were very much against it. But their ideas begin to seep down into public consciousness, and it does become a fight for gender equality, as we're about to see. As far as Enlightenment philosophers go, you should know about Locke and Hobbes and Voltaire. They're kind of the major big philosophers. But like I've been saying with these other topics over the last couple of weeks, you don't need to know everything about them. If I were you, as long as you recognize those names, Locke, Hobbes, and Voltaire, and if you see them in the DBQ, you go, oh, yeah, Enlightenment philosopher. And then make sure you know a little bit about one of them. Make sure that if there is a DBQ about something with the Enlightenment, that you could talk about one of these guys and give some outside evidence about what they wrote or about their beliefs. So nothing, you don't have to write a giant paragraph. Usually a couple sentences or something like that would do you well. So make sure you know a little bit about one of them, and you can intelligently discuss them on an essay if you need to. Okay, so as far as major impacts of the Enlightenment as time goes on, as we move into the late 1700s and definitely in the 1800s. First off, there really is just this kind of, the ideas of politics and governance kind of get flipped on their heads. The question used to be like, what can the people of the country do for the king? How can they serve the king? And it gets flipped around. How can the king or the political leader serve the people? How can the king or political leader protect citizens' individual rights? That's a big part of this, is this new idea of individual rights, that everyone should be treated equally under the law, whether you're a poor peasant farmer or you're a minister to the king or you're the king himself. Everybody should be equal under the law, and the government should be there to protect those individual rights. And the individual rights kind of differ depending on who you're talking about, which philosopher you're talking about, or what part of the world you're talking about. But, in this country, we have things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and, freedom from oppression from the government, that sort of thing. But it's almost like this new way of talking about governments and the roles of governments. And of course, as we're going to see here in a second, it's going to lead to revolutions in the United States and in France and in Haiti and all across South America and Central America. You also, over time, see the abolition of slavery and coerced labor. I mean, really, by about the mid to late 1800s, slavery is pretty much eradicated from the world. And, sadly, I understand that there are still pockets of slavery even today. But the fact that it's pretty much gone is a big testament to the importance of the Enlightenment. Because when you look back at history, there have been forms of coerced labor and slavery going back to some of the earliest civilizations all over the world. And now it's pretty much gone. And again, that goes back to this idea of the Enlightenment and individual rights. That no, it is not okay for one human being to own another human being, or for one human being to force another human to work for them for no pay. And then, like I already said, we start to see the push for women's suffrage, the right to vote for women in the United States, across Europe, and other parts of the world. And we start to see the modern feminist movement emerge because of these Enlightenment ideas. All right, the lady there on the right is Mary Wollstonecraft. So let's talk about her for a second. She was one of the early British feminists, wrote a very important book called Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And so I've given you a quote here. And what I'd like for you to do is, in a second here, when I say go, you're going to pause the video. I want you to write about, just kind of jot down some notes. What's the main idea of the source? What's the point she's trying to get to? And then also jot down a couple of Enlightenment ideals that you see in this text. What are some ideas that you notice that came out of the Enlightenment that she uses? So take just a couple minutes to do that. Like I said, pause the video, and then I'll be back here in a second. Okay, ready? Pause. All right, welcome back. Main idea here. First off, don't write something in your main idea like, women should be equal to men. Well, okay, yes, women should be equal to men, and Wollstonecraft definitely said that, right? But that's a little too simplistic. You guys are AP students. You can do better than that. The point of this document is about education, that women should be educated in the same way as men. You can see that at the very first line, where she talks about the problems for women. She attributes it to a false system of education, because education is done by men who are considering females rather there's women. That was a major issue. That yes, some girls did go to school in England in this time, but did not study the same subjects as men. And so we see here her call for equality in education. As far as Enlightenment ideals go, she says here women are rational creatures. Again, think about that idea of humans making their own observations and coming to their own conclusions. And yes, she is fighting for gender equality here, the equality of all people under the law. Again, another Enlightenment ideal. All right, but let's talk about the Atlantic revolutions kind of briefly here before we get into other topics. Okay, there's kind of four, like I said, that you need to know. And they do sort of go in order here. So let's start at the beginning. 1776, the American, well, 1775, 76, depending on how you want to say when the war started, we have the American Revolution. Guys, when you think about it, George Washington and that whole gang, they're kind of the original revolution hipsters. They were fighting to end colonialism and throw off their colonial masters before everyone else was, before it was cool, right? So, American Revolution happens. America declares independence from England, no longer a colony, now its own country. Establishes democracy, one of the first major democracies that we see in the world. Now, remember that there were a lot of Frenchmen that came to the United States to help fight this war. And the French government gave a lot of support to the American colonists. mainly to kind of stick it to the British because, the British and French were enemies at the time. One example would be the Marquis de Lafayette, who's there at the top. And when those Frenchmen returned back to France, they're full of these ideas of democracy and liberty and all of that. And they're looking around the situation in France, where you have a king in Louis XVI, who still considers himself to be an absolute monarch. And the people of France are starting to question that, like, what's the role of government? They're inspired by the Enlightenment, they're inspired by the American Revolution, and that, of course, leads to the French Revolution and the overthrow and eventually execution of the king. Now, I wish we could get more into the French Revolution. I really do, because, okay, y'all know that I'm a giant history nerd, right? Let me just kind of explain to you how much of a history nerd I am. I'll tell you a quick story. My little sister got married it's been about 5 or 6 years now, and she got married in Memphis, Tennessee. So we did a family road trip, me, the wife, the kids, drove to Tennessee. It's about a 10-hour drive each way. So about 20 hours total in the car. Now, my wife doesn't like to drive on road trips. It makes her tired, and that's fine. I'm totally cool with driving, because the number one rule of a road trip is that the driver controls the radio. There is no arguing. The driver is in control. Everyone knows this, right? Because everybody else can put their headphones on. You got your own devices, listen whatever you want. The driver has to control the radio. Well, if I'm in charge of the radio, I don't put music on. I put history podcasts on, because that's what I listen to in the car. That's what I listen to when I work out. I ran a couple of half marathons last year, and I listen to history podcasts the entire time. It's what keeps me going when I'm running. It's what keeps me going on road trips. And this trip to Memphis, I listened to a 55-part podcast series on the French Revolution. Each podcast was about 45 to 50 minutes long. So you do the math, you can figure out how long it took to listen to it. It kind of drove my wife nuts. I think she got kind of mad at me, but that's okay because the driver's in charge. So yes, I wish we could sit here and talk about the French Revolution for the next couple of weeks, but sadly we cannot. But anyway, shout out to Mike Duncan of the Revolutions podcast. He does an incredible job with that. And he actually covered all 4 of these revolutions. If you want to listen to more, and if you have the time, I'd check him out. But anyway, the French Revolution, there's a ton of twists and turns. We're not going to get into it. Of course, the French Revolution eventually is going to lead to the rise of Napoleon. And actually, it's going to be craziness in France for the next 100 years, but we don't have time to talk about it. But the French Revolution is eventually going to lead to the revolution in Haiti. Because remember, Haiti, or at the time is known as Saint-Domingue, was a French colony in the Caribbean. In fact, it was a very lucrative colony for the French. But with the French government trying to handle all the revolution things, they could not hold on to this colony. And you have stories of what's happening in France. We're going to look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen here in a second. That's inspiring slaves in Haiti, like Toussaint Louverture, a former slave in Haiti, to want to have independence and end slavery there. So the Haitian rebellion actually begins as a slave rebellion, but eventually turns into an independence movement for Haiti. So now we have the United States that beat their colonial masters and the British. You have Haiti, who beat their colonial masters and the French. And now you have the people of Latin America who are being controlled by the Spanish. They're colonies of the Spanish. And we start to see a series of revolutions in Latin America. So all through South America into Central America. The main guy you need to know there, of course, is there on the right, Simón Bolívar. And again, this is not one big revolution like the American or the Haitian. It is a bunch of several revolutions that go over several years. And eventually you end up with the major countries of Latin America that we know today. And it's pretty much the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And yes, the Spanish tried to stop it, but also they're dealing with the issues of Napoleon doing Napoleon things across Europe because of the French Revolution. So all these revolutions are kind of going hand in hand. But the big thing I want you to take away is how the Enlightenment inspired them. So what I want to do now, we're going to look at 3 separate documents from these revolutions. And by the way, the College Board says you need to know all 3 of these. This is not one of those deals where I tell you, make sure you know one of them really well. No, you need to know all 3. So let's start with one that you're probably familiar with the American Declaration of Independence. And what I'd like for you to do is what we just did a little while ago. Take a second, you're going to read it, you're going to write down the main idea, and then also the more important thing, let's think about Enlightenment ideas that you see in the text. All right, ready? Pause. Okay, the main idea of this paragraph, and it's probably one that you've seen before, but when you really stop and read it, it's about the power of the government and how the power of the government comes from the citizens, and then citizens have the right to change it. Notice there in the third line, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then a couple lines down from that, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The power of the government comes from the people. It is from the bottom up, not from the top down. And then you see a couple of Enlightenment ideals here as well. Unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That's straight from Locke. Of course, Locke put life, liberty, and property. Jefferson just changed it to pursuit of happiness. But that's straight from the Enlightenment. Or in that very first line, all men are created equal. That's, of course, an Enlightenment idea as well. And that is one that is going to inspire these other revolutions. Even if we think about the person who wrote this, Thomas Jefferson wrote this. Yes, the same Thomas Jefferson who owned many, many slaves wrote all men are created equal. Believe me, if you were in my class this year, I'd be dunking on Jefferson so hard for his hypocrisy. But yes, he's very hypocritical, but this is still important because this is the founding document of the United States. And you can almost look at the history of our country as trying to strive towards that ideal that all men are created equal. Are we there yet? No, not at all. We still got a lot of work to do. But you can see the striving for it throughout American history. And like I said, for world history, ends up inspiring these other revolutions. All right, let's move on to the French Revolution. Again, you need to be familiar with the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is essentially their Declaration of Independence. It was laid out by the revolutionary government, their ideas to start the new government and their ideals of what they want to start. So, same as last time. Pause the video, read, write the main idea, and then give some examples of Enlightenment ideals that you see. Ready? Pause. Okay. Main ideas here. The biggest one, government leaders need to protect the rights of citizens. And it says it right there in the second and third lines. Talking about the sacred rights that governments have to protect. And then when governments ignore it, that's when it leads to public calamities and the corruption of governments. As far as Enlightenment ideals go, governments and individuals can be corrupt. This is something that a lot of Enlightenment philosophers talked about. You do have a need for a government, but you also need to have a need for checks and balances in the government because individual leaders can be corrupt too if you give them too much power. That's one of the problems with having a monarch. And there is really a need for a written constitution. Because remember, in many monarchs or across Europe, there was not a written constitution. And so kings could kind of talk about the idea of individual rights, but when push came to shove, there was nothing there to enforce it. So that need for enforcement to make sure individual rights are supported is important, and to make sure that everyone knows exactly what individual rights we're talking about is important. And that's why if you keep reading this document, the rest of it's just a list of rights that every French man and woman should have. Okay, one more document that you have got to know about. Again, these three you have to know about. And that is Simon Bolivar's very famous Jamaican letter, or it's also officially titled his letter from Jamaica. Now, this document's a little bit different than the first two because it's not setting forth a new government, but it is Bolivar's ideas on governance, even if it's not before he starts an actual new government. So again, take a second, read main idea and Enlightenment ideals. Ready, pause. All right, welcome back. Main idea here, this is about colonies and colonial masters. The fact that the people of Latin America should be able to govern themselves. All right. Remember, they've been controlled by the Spanish now for the last couple of hundred years. And he gets into the last couple lines. If we could at least have managed our domestic affairs and our internal administration, we could have acquainted ourselves with processes and mechanics of public affairs. He said because they were not, because they're being controlled by the Spanish. And the second line, we're still in a position lower than slaves. So the Enlightenment ideal here is the idea of self-government, that people in an area should be able to govern themselves, not be controlled by some sort of colonial master, especially one that's across the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so now what I want to do is kind of put all three of these together. And you have a couple of ways of doing this. If you've written down some notes, hopefully you have, you can just look back at your notes. If you'd rather see all three documents together, down in the Google Drive that I keep talking about right below us, I put all three together in a document titled 5.1, 5.2 docs. I know, very creative title there, but you can open that up and read all three together. But what I want you to do is kind of I want you to write down what themes do you sort of notice through all three documents? What's the connecting tissue between the three? So read over them again, look back at your notes, think about what we just talked about. What themes do you notice going across all three? So take a few minutes, download the documents if you need. Ready? Pause. All right, something that you can see in all three of them. First, again, as we've been talking about, the importance of individual rights as definitely an Enlightenment ideal. Secondly, that governments have to protect those individual rights. Now, keep in mind, they're not specifically talking about which form of government does that best. Does it have to be a democracy? Can it be a monarchy? Whatever. The form of government's not the important thing. It's that the role of the government is there to protect individual rights. As long as it's doing that, it's fine. And then the citizens have the right to overthrow those governments. In all three cases, we see major revolutions because citizens feel as if their individual rights are not being protected by the government. So if you, for example, have all three of those in a DBQ together, and you're just trying to figure out what claims can we make here, well, you've got three of them right there. You could put all three of those together and make any of those claims from it. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about today, we talk about nationalism. It's an important topic that kind of comes out of these revolutions, but there's also a lot of other things that go into nationalism as well. And it is going to become a major force in politics in the 1800s and the 1900s. And it's going to lead to some, well, we'll get there in a second. But if we're going to talk about nationalism, we have to talk about the idea of a nation and the difference between a state and a nation. Because oftentimes we use those words kind of interchangeably, and they are two different things. So you need to make sure that you're using these terms correctly. So let's recap definitions real quick. If we're talking about a state, we're talking about a country. It is the thing that you see on a map. It's got a defined border. It's a blob on the map of a certain color. It is a different color than the other blobs around it. It has a government, usually. That's a state, okay? China is a state. France is a state. Brazil is a state or a country. Those are pretty easy to define. When you see it on the map, you know what it is. But when you start talking about nations, it starts to get a little tricky, and the definitions of those get really blurred. But if we're talking about a nation, we're talking about one, it has to be, it's a group of people that are going to share usually a common culture, language, a common shared history, usually a common religion, although not always. And usually it's a group of people that are living in the same kind of geographic area. So if you think about nations, you can say the Chinese people are a nation. You could say the French people are a nation. Now, usually states and nations line up with each other. French people live in France, but that's not always the case because you got to start thinking about how people self-identify. Does everybody living in France consider themselves French? The answer is no. And there are people that are living outside of France that consider themselves French, even if they're not living in the French state. So when you start to get, usually it overlaps, but when it doesn't, that can lead to some pretty serious situations, as we're going to see. Just make sure, though, that you understand the difference between a state and a nation, because it's a very important distinction there. All right, so we're talking about nationalism. We're talking about identity of a nation, that you say, I am French, I am Chinese, I am American, that you identify as part of that nation. So why is it that we start to see nationalism in the 1700s and into the 1800s, and definitely in the 20th century as well? There's a couple things. One, hey, remember a second ago when I said there were printing presses, but people weren't reading that much? Okay, that's changed. By the 1800s, literacy rates are much higher across the world. Books are being printed, they're cheaper to print, plus newspapers and magazines are getting printed to get news out. When you start to have publications that are being produced all over a country, you're going to see a standardization of the language. Think about all the different dialects of languages that are spoken. We have dialects right here of English here in the United States. Smith and I are both from Texas. We probably keep saying y'all a lot. We probably don't even realize we're saying it. Some of you that might live up north are going, oh God, what is he talking about? What's a y'all? We have different dialects around, right? But when it comes to print and you're reading something, usually that's the standard language of the country. So you start to see that standardization of language across large areas. When you share a common language with people, that you share an identity. There's a connection there. You share a common vocabulary. And so printing presses are helping bring people together through language. Also, as I've said, there is a decline in religious identity. Now, I'm not saying that religion is no longer important, because that's definitely not the case. But we do see kind of a decline in how people identify, because now across Europe and other parts of the world, people aren't the same religion. You can't say that everybody in this area is Catholic or everybody in this area is Protestant. So if people aren't identifying with each other in a group by religion, they turn to nationalism. And again, there's been a lot of political upheaval, a whole bunch of revolutions, and really just, like I said, a complete overthrow of what government should be doing. For so long, when you looked at like a country like France, you knew that the people of France, the thing that they all had in common was their loyalty to the French king. But that's no longer the case. So that again, nationalism begins to develop. Okay, can nationalism be a good thing? Yeah, it can. There are some positives that come out of it. It can bring the people of a region together. Otto von Bismarck is there on the right. He's the one that's kind of got a lot of credit for German unification in the late 1800s. Remember, the area of Central Europe was just a whole bunch of little small kingdoms and principalities, and then Prussia. He brings it all together in Germany. There's German unification under German nationalism. Okay, that's good for now. German nationalism's about to get really bad, but for now. And when it does bring people together, it helps to limit the differences between people. So that inside a country, if you can identify as one nation, it helps with gender inequality or economic inequality. So you don't say, hey, we're men and women, we're different. No, we're all the same nation. Or we're rich and poor and therefore we're different. No, we're all the same nation. So it does bring people together. But nationalism has an extremely dark side that we're going to see in the 20th century, because it can most definitely be a very bad thing. Because when you start to define a nation and you start to say, well, these people are part of my nation, then by definition, you're excluding those people over there who are no longer part of your nation. And when you do that, you go down a very, very dark road to racism and exclusion. And by the way, this is an issue that we are still dealing with in the 21st century. Even here in our own country, we're dealing with that fact of who is part of the American nation. And when you start to say, well, these people are American, but these people are not, you're going to have some serious issues. And we see that even today. We also see it leading to both of the world wars. Nationalism was a huge part in causing World War I and World War II. Again, remember, one of Hitler's aims was to expand the German Empire to help the German people, to help the German nation. Well, Hitler had a definition of who was German and who was not. And we know what happened to the people he didn't consider German that were living in Germany. Of course, we know that leads to the Holocaust during World War II. So when it comes to nationalism, it is a very serious issue, again, that we're still tackling in parts of the world today. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the problems in India right now as well as they're going through that, Prime Minister Modi. It is still an issue that we need to look out for today. All right, let's summarize. First off, make sure you kind of understand the role of the Enlightenment and nationalism and how it played in the Atlantic revolutions, with the Enlightenment kind of causing the revolutions. And then out of those revolutions, you do start to see nationalism developing. Again, out of the French Revolution, you see a French nation developing. Out of the Haitian Revolution, you see a Haitian nation beginning to develop. And obviously, when it comes to Enlightenment, make sure you understand the idea of individual rights and self-government. And then when it comes to taking documents and putting them together, think about main ideas, of course, of the document, but also keep an eye out for themes. Keep an eye out for that kind of, what's that thread that runs through a couple of documents that you can use to make a claim when it comes to a DBQ. All right, you got some homework for the weekend that Smith is going to go over with you on Monday. And it is a short answer question, SAQ with 3 parts. Now, I know that you're not doing an SAQ in this year's AP test. I am fully aware. But notice what's being asked here in these 3 questions. 1, describe an argument that the author is making. Hey, figuring out the main idea, figuring out the claim, that's kind of important. And then B and C are asking you for outside evidence. Again, that's going to be an important part of the DBQ rubric. You have to be able to take information either from your big brain or your notes and bring it to bear on a topic. So practice that over the weekend. Smith will go over it with you on Monday, and then I will see y'all on Tuesday. Have a nice weekend. Thanks for tuning in. Bye, everybody.